Well, it's a great time because we're going to have another things hidden discussion, but this time it's with my friend Michael Gibson, who's the one of the founders of the 1517 Fund. He's also a big fan of poetry and other things that have kind of cross sectional interest for us. So thank you for joining me, Michael.
Happy to be here, David, and always fun and pleasure to talk to you.
So wow, what a wild time we're in, where everything feels like it's crumbling, but there's also a lot of hope that's possible, and we have to be able to press forward. You were just telling me that in your sphere of venture capital, things are doing very well. This is not a time of retreat in terms of success for your efforts, right?
That's right. There are a lot of teams still moving forward, developing things, and that goes from three people with ideas at maybe they're not at coffee tables, maybe it's all over Zoom, but they're still getting that first batch of money to run some experiments or try some things out, and then all the way to companies going public. So we had my own fund had a company go public in early December, and Luminar Technologies, they've been making a lot of progress. So yeah, we're seeing advances in at that micro level. Where things are toppling and crumbling seems to be more at the institutional level, the national level, the state level.
Yeah, and now your fund, 1517 fund, tends to target like kids right out of high school, right? Going into college.
Yeah, we do a lot of recruiting on campuses or people who have never stepped foot on campus, a lot of first-time entrepreneurs. That has to do with my former job. I used to work for Peter Thiel and helped him start his fellowship program in 2010. That program paid out $100,000 to people to work on projects, startups, scientific research. But the one newsworthy catch was that you had to not be in school when you took the grant. So that's where I developed a lot of the recruiting pipelines for 1517. But even so, I don't want to say there's an age related to what we do, because it's more about the lack of credentials. So we have invested in older people, but they happen to have not gone to college either. So it's more about being an outsider or not having the expertise on paper that some authority says you need.
Now, has the Teal Fellowship, it still continues? Is that right?
Yeah, that's still going. They take 20 people per year.
Is there an idea to perhaps lower the payment because of the loss of value in going to universities in the first place that's happened since its initiation? They don't have to pay you as much to get out of college now. It's kind of
maybe that's one current. The other current would be, I guess, inflation, which is that the money is worth less. But yeah, I wonder about the last year or 15 months or so, where these private universities charging $70,000 a year have been reduced to Zoom classes. And I have to wonder about parents and students getting upset with the fact that they're paying so much for Zoom classes.
And there's something wonderful about being in a room together and learning about ideas that you just cannot get. It's the energy. There's a feeling when you have folks who are really thinking out loud together in a classroom, but you can't get that when you're on a Zoom.
Yeah, I agree completely. Seminar style, discussing great works of literature, philosophy, and so on. That can be exhilarating, those discussions, but yeah, not available in the last year. And then, the other thing I think about with respect to higher ed, though, is that those types of discussions were taking place in the 1950s and 60s. Lots of people, they're probably all journalists now or whatever, but they used to, they would talk about their university days in the 60s about reading whatever great work of literature at the seminar. And then this is something they point to as the essential thing about universities that can never be taken away or displaced or replaced by something else. But then I have to scratch my head, because it didn't cost much to have a seminar room with 10 people reading a book.
Mm-hmm.
And yet somehow over the last 30, 35 years, the real cost, the price of college has gone up in real terms 4x at least. So why is it more expensive to put 10 people around a table and discuss Moby Dick? That and I can't, and the instruction hasn't improved 4x. So college is good for some things, but why is it still so expensive is a great question.
Right. It's an interesting question. When you look at the trends though going on in the culture, in which you're a fan of poetry, you like William Blake, right? Is that your favorite poet?
He's one of my favorite poets. I love his collection, The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, particularly the section, The Proverbs of Hell. Just some wonderful aphorisms that are very counterintuitive, very romantic and rebellious, but also paradoxical and suggestive. Yeah, I love his vision.
But what do you think about, you're looking for people, your whole business, it depends on finding, people with visions and who think differently, but that is not very culturally accepted anymore. There's this desire to fit in and to stand out by fitting in better than anybody else. That's the only way you can. And so you have this attack on, Shakespeare is now problematic. Shakespeare needs to be removed, and you've got this
Right.
attack on meritocracy. I mean, your whole business is all about finding people who are inspired by poetry and finding people who have some kind of merit achievement in a particular field that makes them different from others. How in the world can such a business like yours survive in the long term if these things are going to be attacked culturally?
Yeah, that's a great question worth investigating. The first thing that I think is worth discussing is this homogenization, this long march towards the middle for just about every young person in our education system, and thinking about why that happened is interesting. So something happened in 1971. There's a great website someone put up called WTF Happened in 1971. And it's a collection of data and graphs about how the American economy changed at that time. And one of the explanations that I think I find most persuasive is this idea that we just started stagnating in a way that we hadn't in the past, especially with respect to science, technology. I think you could argue we had stagnation in the arts. Tom Wolfe has written a few books like From Bauhaus to Our House on architecture, The Painted Word on painting. So on something happened where just broadly, I think our culture started stagnating, and either it's the cause or the effect of some of those things on that are listed on that website. What the hell happened? What the fuck happened in 1971? And so along with that, what happened was the labor market and the economy broadly started to reward certain types of people in ways it hadn't before. There became a premium on people who were reliable, people who could undertake long-term projects that lasted 4 years. It didn't matter what the project was, so long as you were obedient in carrying out your orders and getting your work done. And that's essentially what the college degree became. It became this way of separating the labor market, and employers rewarded people independently of what they studied. For the most part, I think what your major is matters. And so as that wedge started to widen between those who could demonstrate those skills versus those who couldn't, you started to see greater and greater competition to join that first group, and that meant getting the BA. And there are other forces at work here on the admissions committees in universities determining who gets in and who doesn't. And then all of a sudden, that admissions committee became this arbiter of national virtue and vice and meritocratic accomplishment. And so now we have 5-year-olds to 18-year-olds all competing to become the same sort of person that admissions committee likes. I think there are probably other trends at play in terms of conformism, but that's one of the more interesting ones that I've been focusing on, because when people are young, have so much energy and they can be so creative. And it's sad to me that so many people are sacrificing their youth to compete in that dog race, chasing some mechanical lure for prestige.
Isn't 1971 also the last date last year that, when Nixon severed the last remaining links to gold and the dollar?
Yeah, that's actually, that is one of the factors for sure. You see a definite break in a lot of economic indicators due to that decision.
Yeah, there seems to be a kind of, Mark Spitznagel talks about the Tao of capital, right? And there seems to be some kind of cultural rot that takes place when you try to if you try to unethically mess with the laws of economics, like when you sever any last link to grounding money into reality. What does that do? When you go full in on what the Bible would call unjust weights and measures, the fiat currency, right? That distributes money, redistributes wealth from the poor and the middle class and those on fixed incomes to those who get the newly created credit first, which you would call, that would be the paper belt, right? You call that the paper belt?
Well, right? Yeah, I think the paper belt is a term. I didn't invent it. A friend of mine did, but it describes this region from DC to Boston because so many of the mainstay industries there rely on paper and yeah, we print money on paper. The Fed prints, but by and large, most of the money printing they do is.
It's like there's like consequences to messing with these laws of moral.
Right. I think there is a profounder parallel between the this monetary policy and the decision to unlink money from a grounding in reality. So that's one thing. And then in parallel to that is, I think, just a broader, what is it? Our society placed a greater emphasis on subjectivity over objectivity or reality. I think, after World War II, certainly going back into the early 20th century, the ideas like moral relativism are related to this because if good or bad is only what makes you feel good, or if it's only about pleasure and pain, that's really a discussion about the importance of subjectivity. And I think that really that divergence really widened in the last 50 years as well. Mm-hmm. You look at a lot of the self-help literature, it's more about changing your mind about things rather than changing the world. It's like, okay, things are bothering you out in the world. Well, maybe you should just change your attitude towards it. It's cold outside, just close your eyes and think of the warm weather. And that inner turn towards the subjective, I think, is related to even the idea that we can decouple money from anything, any real store of value.
Yeah, it's interesting. It all kind of comes together at the same time.
Right.
So is economics a moral philosophy, or should it be?
Well, I think there's certainly descriptive investigations that people should undertake, but I don't believe in an purely objective scientific method, in the sense that we are humans and by nature we're choosing some problems over others. We're privileging some observations. We're, even in our perception, I think we are, they're value laden to some degree just by how we pay attention to things and what we're aware of. But economics, I think, certainly in terms of, I guess the real divergence is sometimes economics is accused of just saying, hey, humans have these preferences and here's how they satisfy them, without examining morally what those preferences are. So if someone, wants to smoke cigarettes, eat junk food and die young or whatever, then that's just what they chose to do. And we shouldn't comment about whether or not that was a good life. I think there's no separation though. I think we can examine the good and still be good economists, but I guess maybe I don't have anything too deep to say on that.
Yeah. So you're looking at these last 15 months and it changed so much for people's lives, and they still want to probably keep that change going for a long time. The Great Reset, the new normal, all these little words they use. And by they, I mean those who really seem to want to use this crisis to consolidate wealth and power for government and its cronies. Um, what does what do you think of this? Are we entering? I mean, we've been in kind of, like you said, a stagnation, at least since the '70s. Are we going to enter into a deeper dark age here, or are we going to? You think this is a quick detour in the forces of liberty and decentralism are going to prevail as we head further into the 21st century?
Yeah. I think one thing that stands out to me in this time frame um, is the poor performance of our governing institutions and civil society institutions as well. So we could look at specific government bureaucracies. We've touched on the Fed. We could look at things like universities, which we've also talked about. And it seems to be the case, I'd say, that over the last 40 years or so, we've seen a lot of these institutions, they set their expectations high for what they can accomplish, and then they fail to meet those expectations. And sometimes they just, outright create catastrophes. So with respect to the Fed and then other agencies in the government in the 2000s, whether it's Freddie Mae or Fannie Mac or whatever, but those institutions in league with Wall Street and the banks were complicit in creating the financial crisis of 2008. And you had people like Alan Greenspan was mythologized as the maestro, as he was characterized as in the title of one biography of him in the early 2000s. And by 2008, when the financial Lehman Brothers failed, the world economy almost slipped into an abyss. By that time, Greenspan looked like a fool. So you had these so-called experts fail to understand the world, fail to make accurate predictions, and they were totally embarrassed. And then, I could pick on Greenspan, and then you could follow that up with Obama comes into office, and his point of view was, well, those experts were the bad old experts, who believed in Reaganomics or Republican economic theory. I have my experts, and they're actually just better. And we're going to enact this stimulus program. They even they made a prediction about what the stimulus would do. Here's the unemployment rate without stimulus. Here's what it will be with our program. And then it turned out that the stimulus did nothing. And in fact, employment was way worse than they had ever predicted. I think that was the reason Obama lost so much support in 2010, the rise of the Tea Party. So you could look at these types of crises and see the same thing over and over again, where these institutions failed, the experts failed, and then they were embarrassed. Fast forward 10 years to COVID-19, I think you see a replay a lot of the same sort of movements and patterns. So the CDC, the FDA totally failed us. The WHO lied to us. The CDC was incompetent. They, for instance, in January to April, if you look at testing for COVID, the CDC prohibited anyone from inventing any kind of test for COVID. Only they were working on something in-house, and the FDA was in league with that. So these institutions were just failing the people.
And they're still failing because they've changed the standard PCR threshold now.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
it's so insane.
For this time, right?
I said line, I said, if you hear someone say, I follow the science, the only science they follow is political science, that's the tell.
Yeah. I always like to remember a quick footnote on that is at the beginning of the scientific revolution, people like Newton and Robert Hooke and so on, when they formed the Royal Society, before that, they had just been a group of people exchanging letters. They decided to form a body in which they could discuss their findings and observations. The term science didn't really exist as we know it. And so they decided to choose a motto for their organization. And they chose this Latin motto that basically says, take no one's word for it. nullius in verba est.
Yeah.
So when people say I believe science, that is the opposite of science.
Right. Right. And the science is the tell, right?
Yeah, the science, right?
The science.
So yeah, exactly. Why over the last year we've seen a number of people make fools of themselves, and these institutions fail us in their stated purpose.
But it's pretty clear to me that it's not just incompetence. They have a dog in the fight. You know what I mean? It's like they have a political agenda, whatever.
Well, so that's what I wanted to get into.
Yeah.
Is we could look at each of these case studies: the financial crisis, COVID-19, and what's interesting is so we see these institutions fail, and then the insiders, the elites, and the experts, instead of reforming and admitting their errors, instead, what happens is they seem to withdraw into self-denial and contempt of outsiders.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things about the internet and mobile phones and so on is I think it's giving people more access to information. And we're starting to see the emergence of these sort of amateur experts who are able to embarrass the insider experts. And yeah, I think that's where we start to see some of this contempt and derision, where people are pointing out things, but the so-called experts are trying to maintain their hold on the center power. So that goes back, I want to say, to the 1990s, maybe even earlier, but I think it's been accelerating because of this diffusion of technology for people to record or make observations and challenge. I mean, think about, oh God, another one pops in my head randomly. Maybe this was like the bellwether, was that Dan Rather episode in the early 2000s. Do you recall when there was this idea that George Bush, the second George Bush, he didn't, he like got off from serving in Vietnam by serving with the National Guard. And I forget what this was, but Dan Rather thought he found this document that proved that Bush had shirked his duties.
Yeah.
And CBS posts this thing. And then some amateurs like, what are you talking about? I've measured the spaces on the typography. This did not exist in typewriters at the time. Right. So you had this outside expert make embarrassing Dan Rather, this media bigwig. And I think that pattern is just going to keep repeating, because not because necessarily these experts are bad people. I think it's just that the world is hard to understand. It's much more complicated than politicians and government actors are willing to let on. And then the political incentive problem is that you have this political economy of people who are trying to maximize and retain their hold on power. They're not interested in solving the stated problems that their organization is supposed to.
Yeah, this idea that there's this battle between incompetence as the explanation or evil is kind of a false paradigm. It's, if you understand mimetic theory, people believe their own nonsense, and that's kind of a form of both, isn't it? This idea that you can lie to yourself so much you don't even know you're lying, and you become lost in a sea of lies. I mean, everything that the media has been pushing has almost been 100% wrong. I mean, they just showed that thing. Oh, Florida was going to die and collapse, and they're fine. Right. They said that I remember when I just saw that they pushed that whistleblower lady who was supposed to be exposing that DeSantis had been, flubbing the numbers, and now they've come out way after the fact. Oh yeah, total fraud. Even the mainstream media has to report that. I mean, everything.
Think about the Dan Rather.
What's that?
Yeah, to go back to the Dan Rather thing to the present, and you just see the media making more and more mistakes and more outsiders pointing it out, right?
But at what point do we start to realize it's not just innocent mistakes? They have a religious zeal for. I see the media as like fundamentalist proselytizers for the worship of the state. It's just like, if you allowed fundamentalist Baptists to run, all the media complex, you'd be like, why are they always selling me on their particular, what's going on here? You would see it more clearly, but because we have this fake delineation between, like politics and the civic structures and religion, we can't see it as well. We delude ourselves into believing that, they just happen to be really dumb about a lot. No, they're not. They're proselytizing you on a faith. They want you to have it. They want you to accept the faith that they have.
I think that's very true. Maybe a good case to delve into would be Donald Trump, where I think the timeline on reactions to Trump was something like, at the day after the election, there was actual self-examination on the part of the left-wing media, where you saw these articles come out where they said, wow, we have not been paying attention to the heartland. And they even pledged to make these journeys into the heartland to, learn more. And I think that lasted about a month, because what happened then, so it went from self-examination to, and maybe actually examining their own failure, into denial and contempt. All of a sudden it became, whoa, Trump didn't win. It was the Russians who colluded with Trump to put him in office, or it was social media brainwashing people or indoctrinating them, right? So it became about denial and contempt. And that lasted for 4 years until Trump was out of office. The media, 2017, the Russian collusion hoax dominated the headlines all year. They kept trying to portray him as this Nazi authoritarian Hitler. And, by any objective standard, Trump, as you may disagree with his policies, and I think he was clumsy in many ways and so on, but he was not Hitler. I don't know what happened to the media during that time, but it was deranged.
Well, I think one thing that happened was that they had a guy in there they did not know they didn't know if he was really going to try to pull out the troops. If Liz Cheney had been the president and $5,000 were spent on Facebook ads from Russia, they wouldn't have made a story about it, because she would,
right.
Wouldn't be a story. The story was that they didn't know if this guy was going to take a real crack at trying to dismantle the legitimacy of the military-industrial complex, which is the heart and soul of DC. I mean, without that, they have nothing, literally.
Yeah, I think the media is oftentimes portrayed as this independent body, but in fact, it's been this propaganda machine tied to the state for many decades.
Yeah, and it's this weird relationship where these big business owns the government, and then these media outlets are also, they have this fusion with the government, and there's this nice little tripartite relationship that takes place. I was just seeing an ad the other day, about from the 50s about all the doctors say you've got to smoke Camel cigarettes. Right. Trust the science. It's like, wait a second. You guys have been doing this to us all along, but now it's like in the last year, they've turned up the heat so hot that it's shocked people out of their slumber about what's been happening, because they turned it up too hot in their zeal to take advantage of a crisis,
Right. Yeah. And I think there's just more sources of information. That creates a lot of uncertainty, because it's hard to understand what's true and what's not. Conflicting views on any issue these days. But the one thing that is true is that the central power, and that's a loose term used to characterize, let's say, the government and the mainstream media. They've lost their monopoly control of information as a source. Information used to be scarce. And therefore, because it was scarce, they were able to, control the diffusion, the narrative of that interpreted events. And because it was scarce, it seemed like they had more authority. Think about Walter Cronkite and how everyone who was alive then longingly remembers him as this, authoritative man. I think it had a lot to do with the fact that he was tied into the only sources of information. But now information is so abundant, and the central, the commanding heights of power in this country have lost control of that information flow, and therefore they've lost control of the narrative.
Yes. And you see that again with look at the Fauci story, that Wuhan Institute of Virology was always right. Singled out as potentially the source of this outbreak. And that was, people were literally deleted off the face of the internet for suggesting that. And now eventually they've maybe there's something to it. As more evidence just continues to come
Trump derangement syndrome was a nasty form of cognitive distortion, where people were unwilling to consider that hypothesis just because it might be in line with something Trump said. Now, fast forward a year, and people like Fauci are more open-minded about considering the hypothesis. There's a great piece on this, by the way, by Nicholas Wade. He's a former New York Times journalist who wrote on Medium a long essay that I think, he says readers should decide for themselves, and I think that's great, but he presents a strong, compelling case that the virus originated in the Wuhan labs.
But we're dealing with a lot of this almost like a Luddite force from the corporate 20th century media, where it's like like you said, they don't want to have scientific, they literally want to retard scientific investigation. You cannot explore that hypothesis because it doesn't fit their interests. So they shut it down, and then people's lives are affected. The mask thing was blown out of proportion. Kids needing to wear masks. They've messed up kids. That I just saw Colorado Children's Hospital has skyrocketing reports of mental health and suicidal ideation for young children. This is insanity. How can a society thrive if adults can't step up and say, get your hands off our family? If we're just going to sit around and say, oh, I guess they just mean well. No, at some point people have to shame bad behavior, and having this kind of stifling effect where you can't say anything, even when it's scientifically accurate. You cannot survive a society that maintains this for long. It's not going to survive. The society won't.
Yeah, I think we saw a lot of government actors fail to adapt to new information over the last year. Maybe that's like the most charitable way of saying what you just said, which was, maybe it was understandable to have such harsh lockdowns in March and April when we didn't know much information about how coronavirus spread or the lethality and so on. But over time, we would expect new information to change people's behavior, and that just didn't happen this year for the most part, and that's frustrating to say the least. And these government actors seemed incapable of thinking in terms of trade-offs. So it could be true that COVID-19 is bad, but are there other things that we have to balance that against, such as the mental health of kids, or people, adults' mental health, or their financial well-being? They have to earn money to take care of their families. So these sorts of trade-offs were never discussed, and to go back to the moral question, they were never debated in moral terms. Instead, it was just coronavirus is the absolute value against which nothing else can be measured. So we must use all these containment policies. Yeah, I don't think that was done effectively.
And now the next thing they're pushing is this, this idea of vaccine passports or whatever to get in. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a complicated issue. If we think in terms of a business, and a business doesn't want to have its employees come in, or customers, unless they can prove, okay, I'm willing to experiment with that. I think where it gets tricky is at the government level, because I don't think they're going to be able to handle that well. Again, they seem incapable of adapting. So I don't know how useful the information will be, but I don't know, at the local level, if some businesses want to operate that way, I say, let's run the experiment, see how it goes.
You see that the media like NBC, they continually tout every day the fully vaccinated. I saw a clip, or was it CBS? They're all the same, but it was like they had a clip where they said the fully vaccinated can now go to Europe. The fully vaccinated can now have fun. The fully vaccinated, they kept saying it over and over again. The fully vaccinated, it was like, it reminded me of that Joe Biden quip about Rudy Giuliani, that there's like a noun and a verb in 9/11. It's like every other word was fully vaccinated. It was like an advertisement. I was like, you guys have lost your step. You don't even know how to like sell people on these things is in an effective way. It's like too obvious.
Right. I think it becomes wrapped up in Biden's success as a president, and really about control. But I mean, think about the obverse of this, which was the post George Floyd situation with race and violence in this country, and just the absolute disregard for any of the consequences of policy or allowing things to happen this past summer. I mean, the idea of peaceful protests, God, that was Orwellian in nature, and in the opposite of sort of the fully vaccinated thing, right?
Yeah, it's a consistent theme that the media continues to be kind of out of touch with what we see around us, right? I mean, that's kind of a consistent theme, that Um, they push a narrative of trauma and division at all walks, at all moments. I think it feels as if folks want the powerless to fight the powerless. It's like you don't want people to start saying, hey, wait a second, why you want one size fits all medicine? I mean, I don't care if if they're trying to push people to take Flintstone vitamins. You don't tell people what to, you had Joe Biden the other day saying, the unvaccinated will pay the price. And it's like, well, what does that mean? I mean, how much, what are you talking about there? You know what I mean? When you try to,
at some
who are
point, people
you?
are adults and they have to make decisions for themselves.
Right.
And so long as you feel safe being vaccinated, what's the big deal here? I guess
Right.
maybe there's this fear that these people are going to flood the hospitals if they don't get vaccinated. I don't know, but it's hard to. It does feel a little I mean, here's my instinct saying, okay, there's a totalitarian feeling to some of these things that emerges when they become so strict and so harsh. Even if based on good intentions. So it's like the best interpretation is something like, hey, this is about public health. I can't let you infect my grandma just because you want to be free and go to the store. So I want to try to control you. Okay, well, at some point we have to discuss the trade-offs on these things.
But then it's like you said, they have a tunnel vision about even how they deal with it. For example, one of the things that we've investigated on my show, we had an interview just released this past week with Professor Bruce Hammock and Professor Bruce German of UC Davis, who have been working for decades on investigating the effect of linoleic acid consumption, which is the omega-6 fatty acid found in vegetable oils, and its association with problems dealing with severe pain, as well as ARDS, this acute respiratory distress syndrome. And they just published a new paper in Frontiers in Physiology where they demonstrated that this leukotoxin, which is something directly associated with the consumption of vegetable oils, which our government subsidizes,
right?
Food guidelines push the consumption of these vegetable oils over saturated fats. This is the standard of care when you're in a hospital. They give you these vegetable oils, all these things. All this stuff is associated with severe cases of COVID. In fact, they found that patients who had severe ARDS from having COVID-19 had a massive amount of leukotoxin stored in the blood. Now, they don't want to have a scientific conversation. A scientific conversation, if they wanted to be here's my thing. I always like to walk into the shoes of the people. So, okay, you want to be a good nanny state person, why don't you tell people to get off the margarine? You can have significant reduction of the severity of outcomes of this virus if you had the courage, Dr. Fauci or whoever, to say, hey, you know what? Yeah, I know this is going to hurt Mr. Big Soybean and Mr. Corn Oil and all these guys, but lay off the margarine, lay off the mayonnaise, for God's sake.
That's fascinating. I don't know about that, but right. I wouldn't be surprised that that's the case, meaning that, some discoveries have been made and large government actors are incapable of identifying those discoveries or acting on them, and mainly because it's against their interests.
Right.
I mean, even more broadly, the government has for like 50, 60 years has been promoting one kind of diet. And now in the last 5 to 10 years, it seems as though the food pyramid was actually making us worse off in terms of health. So it's again, another failure of failures of elites in large institutions. But I also want to say that the left doesn't believe in science, or it's like they're not actually only on some issues, right? If it's climate change or some aspects of COVID-19. But then there are issues where the left is just totally out to lunch. To take one example is just genetics and evolutionary psychology. This whole idea about sex and not being real is just so anti-science. And then even economics and some other parts of social science where the left just does not want to look at the data.
How does a relatively left-wing mind think about the fact that now it's come out that like all the corporations are on their side? Like, do they feel weird about that? Because they used to be so critical of Pfizer and these greedy.
Right.
I do a series on my radio show called The Great Remembering, where we report past news reports from NBC and CBS and CNN about all the criminal malfeasance of Pfizer and Johnson and Johnson, all the times they got busted for making false claims about Bextra and Vioxx and Johnson and Johnson baby powder causing all these different problems. We report on these things from these mainstream media outlets just to remind people that this is the record of these outlets according to these same sources who now tell you need to inject their their new vaccine on your 6-month baby for a virus that doesn't do anything really to 6-month babies. This is such a weird time to be a left-wing person in some sense, because now you've spent your entire life, your whole narrative was that big Coca-Cola, big bank, big military industrial complex, the Cheneys, all these guys were your foes. And now it's like a new wrestling script where it's like, hey, look, they're good guys now. Look. And you're like, wait a second, what'd you do? You just changed their tights.
Well, I think, I want to say, though, I think it's worth paying attention to the rhetoric, where I think in the past, let's say that the center of power, these, whether it's the government or these other institutions, the left were outsiders, let's say 60, 50 years ago. And therefore, a lot of their writings and yammerings were critiques and criticisms of those stations of power. Fast forward to today, now the left is the establishment. But what I find fascinating is that they have not abandoned their nihilistic critique, their thought that things should be torn down and that we should raise the past and these traditions and institutions and so on. And so you get these outsiders who are speaking the language of disruption, of revolution, and yet they are the establishment insiders now. So to take the 1619 Project from the New York Times. The New York Times is a powerful institution, and here it is promulgating this view of history, trying to destroy America's past and its understanding of itself, even though the New York Times is itself part of the center of power. That I think is a pattern that we're going to see all over the place.
So when you look at these events, do you think, one thing I wanted to ask you from a mimetic theory perspective is this idea, that Rene Girard talks about of, as you compete, you become undifferentiated, right? You become almost a merger of the two rivals. When you have the context that we have today where everybody seems almost undifferentiated, is there a time in which people should disengage completely from engaging in politics, because that's the only way to kind of stop the maddening cycle of reciprocal aggression? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Anecdotally, I've been off Twitter for, I think, 2 to 3 weeks. I can't remember.
You deleted it or just turned it off?
I didn't cancel my account. It's still open. I just haven't been tweeting. I haven't been reading it. Every so often someone will send me a tweet and I'll look at that. But I've just noticed my own mood and attitude has shifted to a more positive direction, mainly because I'm just not seeing as much negative stuff.
Right.
But I think more to your point, I think I'm not competing along these dimensions as much.
Right.
I'm not engaged in some rivalrous combat for attention over political issues. And I think by disengaging from that, I've freed up my mind to some degree in a way that I can tell is palpable. So that's just anecdotally. But yeah, I think more broadly when it comes to creativity and exploring new ideas and so on, I think that is the solution. One of the solutions is that we do need to question these competitions we're hosting in our country, in our society, whether it's to stand out to college admissions committees, or whether it's to destroy the other side in a zero-sum election. I think to the extent that we can disengage from these things, that more creative possibilities open up.
Now, this is an interesting conversation amongst the folks on the right, because you have like your, you know, your establishment conservative Inc., and that's got a little bit of that neoconservative war focused approach, the Bush style. Then you have this new emerging Trump style thing where it's more about you know, rejecting foreign adventurism, but bringing back a kind of vicious form, not vicious, but a more aggressive form of social conservatism mixed with, you know, protectionism and things like that. So in that conversation, you know, I've peeked in on Clubhouse a few times and heard these conversations happening. And there's these little Gen Z guys are saying, hey, it's time to, we're going to ban porn. We're going to ban critical theory. We're going to ban. I'm like, wow, you sound just as, you know, as as out of touch as the, you know, radical libertarians that you guys like to critique, because both of those things are kind of again kind of imagining fantasies as the solution to the problem we're in. And my point in saying this is that this new nationalist thing, there's good things with some of the things they say, but it feels as if when they hear what I'm saying, they would say, well, you sound like you're telling us to basically double down on the same formula that conservatives have always been losing on, is that we always take the high ground and we always stand by principle, as this nihilistic opponent on the left is just boxing us left and right. And we're saying, I will stand true by principle. You lose. And I'm not saying that, but I know how they could conflate what I'm saying. When I say, from a mimetic perspective, I look at that and I say, the only way to defeat your opponent is this kind of Aikido, allowing them to collapse on their own weight. The more you continually try to go for the bans, you ban this, I'll ban that. You ban that. And it's like that power grab is what keeps their opponent alive. Without that struggle, they just fall on their own face, and everybody in the middle kind of says, yeah, this is just too much. But people were afraid to do that. I was at CPAC and a journalist said, you know, I used to be a big fan of Ron Paul, but as I got older, I realized I've got to survive. I just have to survive. And so therefore he had, you know, joined into this kind of new right. What do you think of this thing, right?
I think take for instance, what we were just saying a few moments ago about this increasing, intensifying hatred for America, its past, its traditions, especially in the context of race, you know, characterizing the United States as racist at the core, that, you know, the real founding was in 1619 and not 1776 or 1787, whatever the case may be. I wonder how long a nation can last that hates itself so much. When you destroy and dissolve all the bonds that hold people together, the shared understanding of history and the sacrifices our ancestors made and so on. I'm not, and when I say this, I'm not disillusioned in the sense of thinking that the United States is this, you know, paragon of virtue, but nevertheless, the amount of hatred and scorn heaped on the past over the last, you know, for a long time now, but increasingly so over the last year, it makes me wonder, is like, okay, if that view of the nation has its hold on the establishment and the elites, how long can this nation last? How long can ethno-masochism last as a guiding philosophy for any country? I can't think it does. And so to come back to what you were saying, it's like, well, maybe the point isn't to debate that issue. The point is to step back and say, okay, well, go for it, and let's just hope the dark ages don't last too long.
Well, that's what it seems to me, that may be the best course of action. Although it's the action that people are least likely to play, the more vicious they get, because there's a survival instinct when you feel like someone's doubling down on overreach and intrusion and viciousness. Your instinct is to fight back and reciprocate. That's what Mimesis is all about. Right. It's so hard to do the Christian approach of, you know, not accepting. See, here's the deal.
Yeah.
You accept the frame of the accuser, because that would mean accepting the lie, that, you know, like Jesus doesn't accept that he's guilty. He never.
I was just going to say, we might as well go back to like, is Jesus, as Peter Thiel once said, the first political atheist?
Right.
And what I think Peter was saying, although I'm not pretending to understand completely, was that the Caesars saw themselves as gods in some sense, the divine right of kings, but applied to Roman emperors, and the divinity of Christ in some ways denies that, in a very big way, right? Not some way, and the fact that by denying Caesar's divinity and asserting his own, he is divorcing himself from that political process.
Right.
So maybe, I don't know, maybe we should, the Benedictine option kind of thing is suggesting itself to me at this point, which is the Christians render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, but nevertheless they pursued their lives independently of what Caesar was doing.
Right. And maybe there's a fusion between engagement and that, in the sense that you can condemn. I think the church is meant to be a media, right? A prophetic critique on state power. And so we complain about the media all the time, but the church as a corporate entity does not really critique state power or crony, corporate power. You don't hear the church standing up against the garbage. There's, churches should be places where you learn about vegetable oils and how, Coca-Cola and these big companies have been pushing these things into our body. You should learn about that, because we in the church, we care about the body just as much as we care about the soul, right? So you're equipping your flock with not just Gnostic, Platonic concepts of this abstract, disembodied Jesus, but rather embodying the life of Jesus by helping your neighbor overcome struggles like mental health and illness by changing little small things in their diet that could be tremendously helpful and scientifically pursued for further investigation. And we don't have that embodied concept of a church. We have a disembodied Cartesian kind of Christianity, which is content to have their ideology in their corner and sing songs about a disembodied deity,
right?
Never want to become that role model and actually challenge the power, sources of its time. With
I think that comes
revelation.
out in the way people speak about these things. So it's always, the question of God is always discussed in terms of belief these days. Like, do you believe in God? Which is a very mental conversation, meaning it's like, what is the mental state you have about this this entity or hypothesis? Whereas I think religious practice is much more an embodied practice. It's not just about statements of belief. It's also about your way of being. And I think that maybe that's what you're getting at. I think with the Cartesian is this divorce of the mind and the body.
Right. That's what I see happening today right now is there's this desire to, and you have that in everything. I believe in the America as an idea. America is an idea,
Right.
or I believe in, this idea.
Yeah, I don't even know what that language means when you examine it. It starts to fall apart on examination. What does it mean for someone to believe something? But because in my mind, it is just so intellectual and abstract to say you believe in X.
Right. So in some sense, it's in order for us to escape stagnation, we have to be able to get outside of this kind of Gnostic house of mirrors in some sense, where you have this detachment from embodying what you're trying to say you are about, that's you see that in so many aspects of our culture.
One of the we've talked about Nietzsche and Christianity before, and Platonism. So what it's Nietzsche hated both to some degree. So his criticisms of Platonism and Christianity are similar in that he thought your view of metaphysics would leach and bleed into your morality and degrade them. And so Plato famously believed in these abstract entities, the forms, and that the deeper, truer reality was something that was beyond our visible, sense, the world that we see with our senses. Yeah. And Nietzsche's conclusion was that kind of view about the nature of the world leads you to privilege the unseen over the seen, the mind over the body, and Nietzsche rejected that. And then and I'm not quite sure why he made this jump, but then he read that same critique into Christianity, thinking, and maybe that's tied to views of the afterlife and so on, that if we're always thinking about some other world that is in some sense realer than this one, then we will, privilege that world over this, the spirit over the body. But what's fascinating is that is not the true understanding of Christianity. I'm not a scholar, but the Word was made flesh states plainly this paradox that somehow the transcendent order of that guides the universe is and that deals with eternals and absolutes and abstractions and so on, was made flesh, meaning it was embodied at a certain point in time and place. And so a true understanding of Christianity is actually Nietzschean, in that sense, is that the body and the spirit are one, and there's a creative maybe tension there, because there's a paradox. It's like, how is something eternal made temporal? But I think people, I don't know, maybe this is just like intellectual history, but I think it's interesting that people have overlooked that.
Yeah, it's true. And he had more of a love-hate relationship with Jesus, but he didn't really like Paul, because I guess he thought Paul kind of took it into more of a ideological, place of the mind, and whereas
Right.
Jesus was more action-oriented, but people weren't, he didn't believe people had the capacity, enough people had the capacity to actually imitate Jesus for Christianity to do what it was supposed to do. So therefore, Christianity unleashed without proper imitation of the source would just create hell on earth, which is what he thought was happening with.
That's well said. Yeah. And maybe it speaks to the difficulty of the present moment, which is, it is very difficult to pursue the Christian line of thought and action in today's world, to imitate Christ in a sense, right? Because we get swept up into the rivalrous competition over these scarce goods and positions, and
that's what people say when, if you listen to these conversations. And the right, if you interject what I'm suggesting, which is to allow them to, don't go for the centralized power. They want to ban America. You don't go ban their thing. That's not going to work. They can't see that. They just think you're, okay, you go ahead and fail. I'm going to go ahead and grab power. That's the only thing we have left to do. Yeah. We're about to be destroyed. We have to. But that's how history has always been. History has always been, your opponent looks like they're going to smoke you out of existence. And that's why everybody grabs for the power. You think Peter, when Peter was telling Jesus, hey, don't tell me you're going to go die, you think Peter was like saying that because he was just a jerk? Or do you think he felt like he was backed up against the wall by a very oppressive cultural power source that deserved to be overthrown? He obviously believed, and he had real reason to believe, that Jesus was throwing away the whole game by refusing to take his power that he was building with thousands of people in the countryside and storm the Capitol.
That's a powerful story. That's interesting.
We're the 99, hey, we're the 99%, and we're here to overthrow the corrupt Herod, and we're going to throw out Pontius Pilate while we're there. That's what Peter had in mind when he said, Jesus, let it not be that you would be crucified. That's a total failure. And that's the question that we're dealing with today. Is that people
I think on a practical level, we would do well to pay. I think it's important to criticize institutions and actors, but I think we also need to have positive visions and to build them. I think we need to. I mean, that's part of living the philosophy, is that it can't just be about tearing down what's present and leaving nothing there. It has to be about building something new on your own somewhere else in some way, rather than tearing down the old and trying to sit on top of the heap.
Girard talks about this idea that Christianity, one of the things it does, for good or bad, depending on how humans use this, is that it kills our fear of nature, right? In the pagan world, there's a very deep fear of the forest and the wood. It was like, you don't mess with the sacred of nature, because there are gods and spirits, and there are punishments if you disturb the nature, right? This could be demonstrated. Have you seen that movie that came out a couple years ago? What is it called? Man, it slipped my mind. The one where they go into the Swedish cult and they're doing all kinds
Oh,
of.
I haven't seen that, but I know what you're
Yeah,
talking about.
it has that kind of thing
It
in there if
looks
you want to see
beautifully
that.
shot and bright summer in
Yes,
Sweden.
yeah, Midsummer. Yeah, that's right.
Okay, Midsummer.
That's the
Okay.
name of the movie. You watch that and you'll see what it was like to live in that pagan framework from in a cartoonish way. But anyways, by dispelling of our fear of nature that allows us to go like you want to do, which is go off to the stars and create nuclear fusion, because that's a good thing. That means it's a thoroughly Christian trajectory of trying to cultivate the earth and cultivate nature and to use it for the betterment of mankind. That's what it means to be the viceroy of creation. That's what it means to fulfill the original mandate in the garden. So that's a good thing, but it can go too far. Like I think,
Yeah.
Girard talks about the apocalypse being this merger of nature and man, right? And that's where you get this concept of these monsters. These are symbols of a merger of the order of man and nature coming kind of unified. Now he identified it in some different places like climate change and mankind creating things that could create climate change.
Right.
But I think he would have been interested to see the gain of function research that perhaps could have been the thing that unleashed this devastating thing, that the gain of function that was going on in Wuhan Institute of Virology. Who knows if that's the actual place, but if there's a lot of evidence towards that humankind trying to play God, trying to take spike proteins and inject them into coronaviruses, into humanized mice to allow them to see if they could overcome them in the lab, that kind of lack of fear of nature creates situations in which global catastrophes happen.
Right. It's fascinating. It's so, technology, is it good or bad in its nature? The standard assumption is that, well, it's just a tool and independent of any human, it's morally neutral. But what ends we put those tools towards is really what determines it. But I'm not quite sure about that. Maybe some technologies have an essence that is antithetical to the good. And that, having said that, though, I want to say that a lot of the debates in the philosophy of technology or bioethics, they tend to just boil down into that character in Jurassic Park, the Jeff Goldblum character who says, you were trying so hard to figure out if you could do it, you never stopped to think if you should, and therefore we must, prohibit all things. So it's like we need to have these debates, but I'm not quite sure if we're good right now at making these judgments about what is good or bad technology. It's hard to predict. But certainly, some things are more dangerous than others. Nuclear, fission, or altering viruses to become more contagious or virulent. All these things speak of great danger.
Especially when apparently the Wuhan lab had the security level of BSL-2, which is the equivalent of a dentist office. Michael, I want to end the conversation with just a little look at the future, and I'm going to throw a curveball at you.
Okay.
So Lou Elizondo, I'm going to interview him. He's the guy that ran ATIP, the Advanced Aerial Threat Identification Program for the Pentagon, the Unidentified Aerial Phenomenon.
Fascinating
stuff.
I've
seen a few of these pilot tracking devices showing blurry video of this little thing going like this and then dipping in the water and coming out. And I asked, Michio Kaku said it could be advanced hypersonic drones. And I said, but do we know any hypersonic drone that goes in the water and comes back out? And he's like, no, we don't. So I was like, what do you think of this? First of all, here you are, you're the one that's talking about, and you're looking for all these great of technology. This is either one, amazing feats of technological leaps that humans have made. Two, it's just totally misinformed. It's not what it is at all. We're getting it wrong. It's a seagull or something. I always got to put that variable in there. Number three, it's something from another, country. And number four, it could be something else. What is it?
I love the topic. I think it's incredible. because something's going on in the sense of maybe the malfunctioning of cameras, maybe it's just an illusion, but I think that's worth investigating in and of itself. We could also think about what could be also interesting, independent of any extraterrestrials, is, okay, we have this information that is somehow corrupted by cameras or other sensors, and then the effect that information has on our military and so on is fascinating too.
Yeah.
But okay, leave that sociological stuff aside. I think we have to consider all the hypotheses right now, and I'm not willing to say that it's definitely not unusual. Let's go with that. It is unidentified. What could it possibly be? Well, I don't know. Now we have to reach towards broad assumptions about intelligent life and culture. So the standard objection is pretty good to me, which is, how come they just don't announce their presence? Why are they kind of sneaky but also careless? On like 99% of the time they're pretty good at what they do, but that 1% they're kind of careless and they get caught. Like, why? How can an advanced civilization allow that level of incompetence on the part of their explorers? I mean, why would they travel light years to this planet only to make a few mistakes here and there? It's just that seems peculiar to me. And then thinking about the technology is okay, or the science is like, what would motivate an alien civilization to come here? Are there resources here that they don't have elsewhere? Why? It's hard to understand the purpose of coming here. And then the testimony of the pilots, that's the most compelling thing to me, because these people are perfectly sincere in their recollections. That one Navy pilot who's been interviewed by 60 Minutes and Joe Rogan and so on. I mean, that guy describing the white Tic Tac, he sounds like he's narrating an event that happened in his life. He does not appear to me to be a person who's lying to gain attention.
And that Nimitz video you're referring to has multiple witnesses at multiple
right,
places,
and multiple pilots, right?
And different pilots, and also the ships, and also I believe a submarine was tracking it going underwater too.
Okay, yeah,
so they've got multiple layers of confirmation of that one.
If it's not an alien intelligence, then the next possibility is that more extreme, perhaps, is maybe it's some human civilization that is either a secret civilization, or from the future or the past or something. Who knows? All right, we can't. What if we're talking aliens? Why not talk time travel? And then the next thing would be to say, is there some way that either within our own military or from a foreign military, there have been advances and they're testing them, and what our own military doesn't even know what the other side of the military is doing. That's possible too, but I don't know. I think we need to dig into this. I'm not going to say it's definitely an illusion or that it can be debunked. I think we have to keep our minds open.
And why does the government report that they seem to be messing with the nuclear stuff? They like messing with
I haven't seen that. So they do the geography where this stuff takes place.
They like to hang around nuclear, and they've been known to shut off. There's been some reports that these things hover around and then they like turn off the nuclear weapons or something. And
okay, I haven't seen that, but
so they're
all right.
They're hippies.
It could be if new information comes to light that reveals more about their libertarian, their goals and purposes.
Ron Paul, you don't know what's going on. We have no idea what we're dealing with here, but at the end of the day, it is very interesting, and it feels like all the dreams of the '90s are alive now. You know what I mean? We've got science books about near-death experiences are kind of like a thing now, documented scientifically.
Right. We've got
UFOs acknowledged by like every major media.
We've got lines for gas.
So that's the good thing, like we have a lot of crazy chaos, but also a lot of like all the hits of our childhood are like coming back. You know what I mean?
One of the cool things about the UFO story to me is that I think it enlarges the mind to think about what's possible. Like, I mean, think about the current state of science and technology, and if we believe, and if in your mind you could actually entertain a hypothesis at with a probability of 0.001%, but not zero, that anti-gravity is possible. then maybe we'll go out and build it, right? I mean, maybe we'll figure it out.
That was my question, was if you were meeting a young kid out of high school who says, I've watched these videos and I've created a technology that would create anti-gravity, do you think that, and if you verify, you're like, yeah, actually there's something here. Do you think?
Well, yeah, I think this is like the running the mile. Well, who was the man who broke the mile? Scott Bannister? Was he the guy who, the 4-minute mile? I can't remember, but there was this barrier. And once the first person crossed it, then others were capable of crossing it.
But yeah, my question is though, hypothetically, if you were to find a young entrepreneur in your search for new investments who could do this technology, do you think that it would be allowed to be put on the market, or do you think it's one of those things where the government's going to come up and say, sorry, 1517, this is not, you're going to need to come with us?
Yeah, it's funny. Is one time with Luminar, I was getting a demo, and of their latest technology. I was down in Orlando, and we, to demonstrate the power of the LiDAR system, we pulled in front of a bank, and the bank had opaque windows, so you couldn't see in. But the LiDAR's laser and its sensor receiver were so powerful that we were able to see the inside of the bank. And I even saw someone go into the bathroom that was located on the back wall of the building. And the CTO of the company was saying at that time, he said to me, it's good that we didn't take any military money, because at this point, the military would classify everything we're doing and use it for defense purposes.
Yeah.
I thought, holy shit, you're right.
Yeah.
So I think that tension is out there, and even when the stakes are much lower. But yeah, I think anti-gravity could perfectly be possible. I don't think our understanding of physics allows it right now, but maybe someone will find a way. There's no way we know the truth.
Well, Michael Gibson, it's always great talking with you. I've had a lot of fun, and I hope that we can do this again sometime and learn some more things.
Yeah, as always, I love the directions and weird places our conversations go. Thanks, David, for having me on.
Very good. Take care.
Okay, man.
Thank you.